Hi, everyone. My name is Tony Burns, James LaSpada. I apologize if you were here to hear about some Canadian banking stuff. We'll just be talking about American banking here for the next half hour or so. So just a little bit of background on us. Try not to walk in front of the screen here. My name is Tony Burns. I am the divisional cloud architect at our retail and direct bank organization inside of Capital One.
And my name is James LaSpada. I'm a senior manager at Capital One. I'm also a tech lead on the DevOps team inside of retail at LOB. And what we do is we develop a lot of the CI/CD tooling framework that other teams can leverage to spin up their pipelines and infrastructure code. So I'm going to first start off with the agenda. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of like where we were coming from originally before we started achieving CI/CD, and how we overcame like all those challenges to achieve DevOps culture and have a fully CI/CD platform. And also, where do we see ourselves in the future? So first, I just want to get a show of hands. Like, how many people here are actually doing full CI/CD? And by full CI/CD means no manual steps. Hmm? Yeah. Okay, so a little bit about our history. Back around like 2014 into 2015, Capital One had wanted to move off of physical data centers and be in the cloud. And this was actually like a huge game changer for us because moving into the cloud, we have access to like APIs, and then we can use that, leverage that to our advantage to do automation, to be able to do like blue-green style deployments. But not only that, like we also get the added benefit of having infrastructure as code. So this means like we can have repeatable environments and testable environments. So also a little bit about our history. So we originally, like we were tasked with the challenge of achieving CI/CD for Capital One. But originally it was just for the online account opening team. So the online account opening actually consisted of 3 different teams. So one of the challenges that we did have at the time, we were ready to do the CI/CD, but we needed a platform to actually do it on. So we did have, there was a Jenkins instance that existed at the time. It was an open source Jenkins, it was the enterprise Jenkins. It was a very good tool for where we were at this time. Like you could deploy into the physical data centers. You could also deploy in AWS at the time, but we had a lot of issues with the connectivity. Like we could deploy, but we couldn't test what we deployed. So we were really pressured to achieve the CI/CD and get all of online account opening up into the cloud. So we ended up spinning up our own Jenkins instance, our own open source Jenkins instance at the time, which was only meant for the online account opening team. In order to overcome this challenge. So we spun it up in the cloud, so we actually had all that connectivity, and we had like cross account roles and stuff like that, so we could actually like deploy into the different environments. So manual testing. At the time, like still around like 2014, 2015, there was a lot of like manual testing that was still happening. So in order to achieve CI/CD, actually you can't have any manual processes whatsoever. So not everything was manual. There was also there was automated testing as well, but the automated testing was more like regression testing that was done on some older types of tools that wouldn't allow them to actually like fit into a CI/CD pipeline. They're more like GUI based. Like I don't want to name like any vendor names of like what the tooling was, but yeah, they couldn't fit into the CI/CD pipeline. They were often like very brittle because the actual testing code would be stored outside of the application repository. It would be in a separate repository, so it wasn't like constantly like up to date. So we wanted to get away from those practices, and we wanted to adopt more of a behavioral-driven development methodology and start using tools like Cucumber. So this way we can have our user acceptance testing inside of the application repository, and we could run this all as part of the pipeline. And we didn't have any automated releases. This was pretty much like developers, like they develop their features the end of the sprint, and they just throw their code over the fence, and it goes to operation teams, and they have to get on a call together with operations and the developers and deploy the code into production. Now, there is some automation that at this time that was happening, but not everything was automated. And plus, like, it's not a good model to follow because when you're throwing your code over the fence, like the operation teams they don't fully understand like the applications. They don't understand all the application needs. And then also like there's like the post validations, like that's not automated. Like there's no like server spec tests or anything like running on the infrastructure to make sure that the configurations are as you expected. There's no automated testing like for smoke testing to make sure that your application came up as expected. So like all that stuff was actually like manual. So it creates like it's error prone. And we also had a lot of huge monolithic monthly deployments. This, more often than not, results in like major rollbacks of code. And it makes teams held captive to other teams' bad code. So lots of time, like if you, like there's that you're putting everything into one code repository because it's a monolithic application. So there's that inter-team dependency there. And if someone writes bad code and it fails in production, everything gets rolled back, and then product isn't happy because they're like, how come my feature's not out there, and it got rolled back. So this is something that we wanted to move away from. We also had a very, very complex change management strategy. Basically, we have a system that we have to create a change order, and we need to do this as a regulated industry. We have to record all of our changes. So at the time, like we had this manual system, you create a change order. The change order tickets actually, for some reason, they had to be older than or exist for like 7 days. I never really quite understood that rule. Usually, people ended up doing was just hoarding change order tickets and then just using them when they needed them. So they got around that rule. So I never really quite understood it. Then once you had the change order, you still had like a 3 to 5 day like lead time window. You had to go through like all these approvals. You had to attend a cab call to go over like what your changes are going to be. Like, is it going to introduce like risk in a production? Then you finally get your approval, and then you actually have to do your release at nighttime, and it has to be within a window where there's no LOB level restrictions or enterprise level restrictions. And unfortunately, I had to be part of this process a lot when I first joined Capital One before we started achieving like full CI/CD. And coincidentally, those days were the days I wanted to go to happy hours. So we ended up like working with the change management team to be able to come up with a much better process and get away from this. And I don't want to get into too much detail because Tony will actually be talking about that in a little bit. So we also had the challenges of the regulated industry. One of like the biggest challenges that we had was separation of duties. Tony will be talking a little bit about this too, but real quickly, separation of duties is if you write code, that code has to be reviewed by someone else and merged by someone else, and it has to be deployed by someone else. So there was really like no way, or we didn't see any reason why we couldn't overcome this through automation. So why DevOps? We really wanted to embrace the DevOps culture because we want to be, or at this time, we were more focusing on being a technology company rather than a bank. And that's really where I see us now. I see us more as a technology company that offers financial services. So we can't just have like a flashy, award-winning app like on the iPhone or running through your browser. So we also need to change those processes that happen on the back end. So we don't want to have any more like manual analog process that I just showed you of like the change management and stuff like that. So we really wanted to be able to continuously deliver software into production, do feature releases that would introduce less risk. So we really just wanted to adopt the DevOps culture so we could do this throughout the bank.
Thanks, James. So James went over a little bit of kind of the history of where we came from and what some of the challenges were in implementing a DevOps culture here at Capital One. What I'm going to talk about next is kind of the journey that we took on the way there. And so the first thing I want to talk about is just, what were some of these barriers to implementing this culture? How did we get past them? And one of the first things that I really want to emphasize is having buy-in from your senior leadership. I've heard lots of stories about companies that have tried to implement a DevOps culture and these kind of modern practices, but if you don't have the leadership buy-in, none of this is going to work. And so we were very fortunate to have that buy-in and even imperatives for this coming from our senior leadership from the very start of this process. And one of the things that we did, and let me back up a little bit here, because at a company like Capital One or any other large organization, you're going to have your lines of business, your application teams, and then you're going to have a lot of other teams out there that run various tools and services at the enterprise level. You have teams like risk management and change management, the teams who run tools like Jenkins and Artifactory and all of those things. And what we really needed to do at the beginning of this process was bring all of those teams together so that we could address any sort of impediments that we might have towards building a DevOps solution in the retail bank organization. So what we had was a weekly roundtable where we had representation from all of these different groups across not only retail bank, but also going into these horizontal teams at the enterprise level. And not only just representation from there, but the representation was the leadership from these teams. And so we would come out of these meetings every week with actual action items from these leaders to go back to their teams with to help resolve some of the impediments that we had. And also, and this is something that we continue to strive towards today, is really forging better relationships with those teams outside of the line of business. I think, in a lot of places, there's not only that wall between application teams and ops teams for deployment, pre-DevOps, but there's also that same kind of wall between, the teams on the ground making the applications and some of these horizontal teams. And it's very important to forge relationships with those teams. So jumpstarting DevOps with a dedicated team. So as James was saying before, the team that I started on when I joined Capital One was a team that was kind of put out there to service just the online account opening product. And our directive was basically, hey, go and figure out DevOps with these guys. Like go figure it out. We weren't the only team that was put in place like this, but we were definitely one of the earlier stage ones to kind of test out this model of what would happen if you put a dedicated DevOps team in with the product teams. And so we not only help them implement a CI/CD process for their applications, but we were also kind of like consultants to them as part of this journey. So for the first, 6 or 9 months that we were with them, we would embed on their teams, part of their stand-ups, have stories on their board to help them, get to this automated CI/CD solution on each one of these teams. And the reality is we would love for all of our teams to be staffed up completely with full stack developers, right, who not only know but are interested in that entire stack from infrastructure all the way up to the application code and the automation around delivery. But the reality is, especially coming from a place where application teams just wrote their code and then pitched it over the wall to the ops teams, you have a lot of folks who have never been exposed to things like infrastructure automation or release automation tooling. And so part of what we also did is, on this journey was a lot of training with them. So we would do chef classes with them, or a lot of our automation tooling was being written in Ruby, and it was mostly a Java shop. And so we went and did Ruby classes. As a result of the work that we did with account opening, we were actually the the first product in the organization to go forward with daytime releases outside of this old change management cycle that James was talking about. And so a big part of that was the pipeline framework that we had developed over time with them. Now, after we were kind of done with our work with account opening, and they were in a good place CI/CD wise, we took all the lessons learned from that, and we started developing a product that would allow other teams across the organization to achieve the same thing with their CI/CD pipelines. We started adding additional use cases for things like ECS applications, Lambda functions, and whatnot. And the approach we took was one that we're starting to call managed pipelines now versus modular pipelines. So you could have a framework, a pipeline framework that was mostly all the bits and pieces that you needed to create a pipeline. And then you're kind of on your own to assemble those pieces into a pipeline. Or you could have what we're calling managed pipelines now, which is very generator oriented. And so we build out archetypes for specific use cases, specific deployment patterns, because what we found was that 90% of the applications, especially new ones as we were moving into this microservice architecture that James will touch on later, all pretty much followed the same patterns, right? You want blue-green deployment for an ECS application, or blue-green deployment for a Lambda application. And so we decided to go the route where we have generators that will create your GitHub repo, your Jenkins file, an application skeleton, and all that, with the idea being that you could hit the ground running as soon as you run one of these generators and potentially be in production within a couple days with your first feature. So I want to talk a little bit more about how separation of duties fits in there. One of the big advantages of having these managed pipelines is that we can provide kind of compliance out of the box with all of the various things that go along with being in a financial services environment. Separation of duties being the big one. And so this system that James mentioned that now allows us to do daytime releases, where there's just a single approval gate as opposed to committees and like 30-day lead time and things like that. But there is plumbing that goes along with that to enable a pipeline to run on this system. And so as far as separation of duties go, all of our pipelines are now fully compliant with that system, so that out of the box, you can prove to the owners of that system that, hey, this pipeline meets all of the requirements for fully automated daytime releases. And we also set up other things that go along with the separation of duties requirements, like peer review checks on the GitHub repos and things like that. And so just talking a little bit more about how we automate that compliance with various enterprise controls. You may be familiar with a system called Cloud Custodian that Capital One developed, then later open sourced, that allows you to specify all sorts of policies around cloud resources in AWS. And so you can enforce things like your tagging policy and whatnot, or say like instance types that people are allowed to spin up. And so by having these managed pipelines where we're kind of generating out the skeleton for you, we're able to also interact with these teams and make sure that everything that we're putting out of the box is going to be compliant with all of those policies. And we get continuous feedback and contributions from those platform teams to help us comply with those controls. We're also able to kind of put out other things that have become policies, such as static analysis and security scanning, uploading test results to a certain place, and things like that. And so best practices as reusable patterns. This is going back to what I was talking about with how most of our use cases ended up being kind of these same few patterns as far as deployment goes. By by having these managed pipelines, we're able to distill those best practices for different things like ECS clusters, ECS applications, even database infrastructure, front-end applications on S3 and CloudFront, and all sorts of other things. We're able to coalesce on what the best solution is for those and put those into this tooling as managed pipelines.
Cool. All right, so building DevOps as a community. So even though like we're the dedicated DevOps team throughout the retail LOB, like we just didn't want it to be us. We really wanted to be a DevOps community. So we wanted everyone to adopt that, to be able to learn and to also be able to contribute. So we wanted to do some things to help facilitate that throughout all of retail. So a lot of things that like we started doing is we would celebrate successes that other teams or members would have. We had also like every year like we have an internal DevOps conference. So we have the conferences and those people that like we celebrated that had some successful releases, like they might have some sessions and some people can learn from that. You have like breakout sessions so other people can just talk about any topics that they want to talk about. We also started something with what we have internally to Capital One is we call Tech College. So it's like courses inside of Capital One that someone at Capital One might have a great deal of knowledge on, and then they can teach like a Tech College course. So we started doing a Tech College course on our framework. So we started with like a hands-on course that people can come to, and then they can use our tooling and then like build out like their CI/CD pipeline with infrastructure code and their skeleton application code that they can start building on. Some of the other things that we did is we have a community Slack channel that anyone can come to. They can post questions. One of the things that I think is like really awesome that we started seeing aside of the Slack channel, we have a lot of members inside of that channel who might ask some questions, and it's not just us as a dedicated team that has to answer all those questions. We actually started seeing the community come back and answering other people's questions. So I think that that's like really, really positive and powerful, that it shows that we're creating more of a community than just having a dedicated team. One of the other things I also wanted to mention is inner sourcing. So it's not just us really to build on our product. So there could be a lot of like different deployment patterns or a language that we might not yet support. So we've been getting a lot of engagement from other teams who actually are interested in contributing back to our product. So that way this can now be distributable throughout other teams because they're reusable patterns. So that's pretty awesome as well. So microservices in the cloud. So back a few slides, like when I was like talking about that huge like monolithic application and how those releases went, and it really was not a good pattern, and it doesn't fit into CI/CD. So we needed to re-architect a while back, going back to like 2014, 2015 again. We re-architected all of our monolithic apps to be more microservice-based architecture. So this allows us to be able to do feature releases, to be able to have like one pipeline for infrastructure code and application code. Doing the releases and feature releases, it's much less risk than doing that huge monolithic releases. It results in hardly ever a rollback. So there's a lot of power to that. Yeah, that's all I have for this slide.
So one thing that all of this kind of distills down to is that kind of represents DevOps now at Capital One is this concept of you build it, you own it. And so the idea here is that development teams now really own their entire application all the way from the code base and through production as well. Previous to this, we had dedicated production support teams, and if there was an incident, they were the first line of defense, but inevitably they'd have to call the development teams anyway. And so now development teams are responsible for all of those aspects of production support for their applications, such as monitoring, logs, alerting. The development teams are the first line on call for their applications in production. And then product as well on the business side. We mentioned this release automation system that gets rid of these committees and things like that. Well, the person pushing that button for production releases is the product owner from the business side now. And so we saw ever since this got rolled out, the product teams have been way more engaged in the releases because, they're directly on, not that they weren't on the hook before for releases that went out, but now they're directly on the hook. And so we've seen, a lot better engagement between the development teams and product owners from this. And so this has gotten to the point now where we actually have a certification process for you build it, you own it inside of Capital One to get your team certified that you have all of these things in place for production support on your application. So self-service for enterprise managed resources. So we've mentioned infrastructure as code before a little bit, and that's really the model that we've followed for all of our applications. Our applications, have their CloudFormation templates inside of the same repos and everything like that. But there's still certain things that, just due to our environment, the either enterprise level teams or the LOB specific public cloud teams manage for you, such as security groups, IAM roles, things like that. But we've made great progress in just the last year on, they've come out with tools that allow you to self-service a lot of these resources instead of going through a longer process of email chains and JIRA tickets on support boards and things like that to get things like that implemented. In addition to that, we have an internal onboarding tool now that a lot of the enterprise services have integrated with that allows you to kind of have a one-stop shop for onboarding your application to all of these different systems like Artifactory and Jenkins and the release management systems and things like that. And so one thing here that I wanted to emphasize about the CI/CD framework that we created is treating it like an actual product. We have an actual product owner on the business side for this tool, and this is and really treating this as a product and not kind of this like side of desk development tool has had an enormous benefit in helping to create a community around it, get people to contribute, as well as the support model. We have a formal support model for this product that includes things like the Slack channel, support ticket system, office hours, and things like that. And then the inner sourcing model that we have for the product, I can say most of the major features in the CI/CD framework at this point have actually been contributed by other teams. Our first mode of development for new features now is actually to go find the team that actually has the use case. You want to do Lambda functions that use closure, for example. Someone came and engaged with us to add that bit of functionality, and we work with them very closely to guide that in and make sure that it's done in a way that's going to be usable by the rest of the community. And then that person or team actually then becomes the champion for that feature. And we've seen this happen over and over with major features like UI applications and Lambda applications that have been contributed by other teams. They're the ones answering the support questions in the Slack channel, and they're the ones who continue to have a stake in it. And so they're constantly submitting pull requests to make improvements or fix bugs and things like that. And then that leaves the core team to work on more of the foundational tool set. A couple things coming along that James will talk about. So just a brief rundown on kind of the impact that all of this has that we've talked about. The entire retail bank organization is now rallied around this pipeline framework. And we've had over 400 new projects on this CI/CD framework since January. over 100 of them are doing daytime production releases already. As I said before, the majority of our major features now have actually come from other teams contributing to the code base. And as far as comparing this to how fast or slow things were before, we've seen a reduced wait time for prod releases up to 99% for pipelines that use this framework.
All right. So some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. In the beginning, I stated that we were just mainly focused on just the online account opening team. And that's really where like a lot of this reusable framework that we had, that's where it was developed. So we wanted to make this much bigger and like create the generators for the projects. So we were really focused on just getting that functionality out there. We did document things, but once we actually put it out there and said to like all of retail, like 1,200, like some developers, like here you go, like here's this tool that you can use. They were like, how the hell do I use this? Like, we had a documentation, but it could have been a lot better. So that was a huge lesson that we learned. So we actually had to change our priorities. We had to ramp up our documentation like hardcore. So we currently use GitHub pages to do our documentation. We have a lot of like concept information that's there that can help people understand like how it's working, what it's doing. But I think the best part of it is we also have tutorials for like every single one of our pipelines, so that people can just like pick up on a tutorial and then they can like run through it, and then it's basically like it's like a how to get started. And it takes you all the way from like integration, pull requests, like all the way out to production. So I think that has drastically helped us out. So some of the other lessons that we've learned is, we're doing like this managed pipeline approach, and that really works for probably about like 99% of the teams, but there really is no such thing as like one thing that will fit like every single pattern. So there are teams out there that it might not fit their pattern. So we took that feedback and now like we want to make something, because there are people that love the managed pipeline because they don't have to worry about it. But we also want to create something that's more componentized, more modularized, where people can just pick up like the components and run with that and create their own pipeline. So one of the other lessons learned is, as I said back again, we were only originally online account opening, and then we went wide stream to all retail. Back in 2015 when we created that Jenkins instance, people were like, oh, you can deploy in the cloud with that. So all retail jumped on it. And then Jenkins was not working well. That was a huge complaint from people. So in the meantime, like, we are cloud-based customers. Enterprise teams had spun up their cloud-based instances, and we're doing everything we can right now to get off of ours and get onto theirs, because they have an excellent platform that we definitely want to utilize. And we want to get out of the business of managing Jenkins and just focus on the tooling. So
we were told at one time that we had actually set the record for the number of jobs running on a single open source master.
Yeah, we had 45,000 jobs at one point. And a lot of them were just junk. Like, people were just creating stuff. So, and we figured out how to clean that up. But yeah, we don't want to be in that business. So down the road, like some of the things that we want to continue doing is we still want to help like maintain this community of the DevOps culture. So we're going to still continue like doing those things, and we're also like working with all the other LOBs throughout Capital One. So we have one pipeline inside of retail. There's 3 other pipelines that exist throughout Capital One as well. There was actually like RevOp was here. They were speaking, so that was another pipeline. So we're actually like trying to align more with the other LOBs and see like where's like the overlap. Like how can we leverage each other and just get more information on that. We also want to get some much better real-time CI/CD metrics. Currently, right now, the metrics that we have, we know, like what Tony was showing, like how many projects are actually like doing like daytime deployments. They're on the pre-approved release. We know how many projects are actually using our pipelines, but I want to get more detailed information. Like I want to know like real time, like what stage in the pipeline is failing. Like I want to know like fail and pass. I want to be proactive into like looking into like okay, if we have an ECS application pipeline and we see it's like failing in a build stage consistently, like why is that happening? Like I want to react before our customers are reacting. 10 minutes, thank you. So one of the other things that we're working on is I mentioned Tech College course. So we're working currently right now to do a self-paced Tech College course. So that way anyone can just go to the Tech College website and they can just do the course pretty much at their own leisure. So that helps us out a lot because now we don't have to dedicate ourselves to like a 3-day course or something for a whole bunch of individuals. So that's something that we're planning down the road as well. Also, like we want to continue the whole inner sourcing aspect as well to do some more complex deployment patterns. Like currently we're looking at like deploying on Kubernetes. We're looking at doing like RDS, like multi-region, any of the complex patterns that are starting to come up. I think that's it. So
Seems like most of this still applied to folks from Canada. So, questions?
So you talked about using, getting some metrics. Are you using your own tool, Hygia?
yes, so actually everything in our pipeline does create a Hygia dashboard for you. So that's actually like integrated in with the Artemis system that Tony was talking about. That automatically gets created for every single pipeline. We're not using that for our team's perspective for our pipeline metrics.
We'll probably be using something along the lines of Elasticsearch or InfluxDB for time series metrics.
Yep.
You mentioned that part of this is open sourced. Is that the CI/CD framework itself, or
No,
part of it?
what I mentioned was open source was the cloud custodian tool, and of course Hygia as well. We have talked certainly about open sourcing the CI/CD framework at some point, but that's currently not in the immediate future.
We had to do a little bit of rewriting, get some proprietary stuff out there. But.
The question is, because you started with kind of a mandate from management to get this done, were you allowed to go anywhere you needed to optimize whatever you needed to, or did you have to engage the business in some kind of tool like value stream mapping?
So we had a lot of latitude in how far we could push on a lot of things, right? So as James is talking about, we ended up spinning up our own Jenkins instance. At the time, the standard was to use the enterprise provided Jenkins instance. I think there were some along the road. There were some things where the velocity of the roadmap for an enterprise tool might have had what we needed in the future, but we needed it now, and so we ended up kind of rolling our own solution inside of retail for it. But at the same time once those solutions that came from enterprise did end up being implemented, we go back and we try to make things compatible with that solution as well, such as like what we're doing now with moving back to the enterprise run Jenkins instance.
Hi, did you have any resistance from the architects, maybe enterprise architects, regarding the going microservices? Maybe someone telling you this domain is so complex that you cannot actually microservice it?
I would say the imperative to go to a microservices architecture largely came from our enterprise architecture and kind of trickled out to the rest of the organization. There's certainly use cases that we still have that don't fit that pattern, and in those cases, there's no, it's not like a 100% thing, right? Like there's, if your use case truly doesn't fit something like that, then obviously you won't build it that way. There's lots of COTS applications, things like that really don't fit that and may not even fit containerization in some ways.
We still have some system of record stuff too that doesn't quite fit it. So
Yeah.
More like a part, an application that's hard to microservice. Never had that.
Oh, we've certainly run into challenges like that. Some of those are still ongoing, and in some cases they overcame it. So.
Hi, I have a question about you build it, you own it. So what percentage of your applications are actually on that state?
I don't actually have that number.
I don't, but I can give a figure that I do know right now currently for retail. 40% of our applications today are PAR active, so pre-approved release. So they for sure are following you build it, you own it.
So is it typically the newer application who actually follow that, you build it, you own it? When I say new, the legacy obviously has its own constraints, right? Unit test not being available, or, there's no resources that would actually fulfill the whole CI/CD process. So how do you draw a line between legacy and the new world with the applications itself?
That's a good question, because I haven't really ran into
I
any.
think we've recognized that in some cases there are going to be legacy applications that really don't fit completely into the YBYO model.
Well, I'm from American family. I'm trying to derive the same thing. So that's where the question is from.
Yeah, and I mentioned certification for the YBYO thing. I think, as James mentioned, there's many teams now that are actually doing the daytime releases, 40% of retail. If you look at what it also takes to get to that point, you're already doing most of the YBYO stuff at that point. Your team might not be, certified on it, but you're certainly.
So do you pass on the cheat sheet for the certification?
There's an entire tech college course actually on it. So there's a lot of resources on it. Again, that's something that senior leadership is really pushing as well for us, and so we have a lot of buy-in to move towards that.
Thank you.
Hi. So you mentioned that in 2015 you were using one single Jenkins instance, right? And what are you using right now?
So back in 2015, that's when we spun up our own, because we still had the on-prem instance that we could deploy stuff through API in AWS, but we didn't have the connectivity. So that's why we needed AWS instance. Right now, we're still running on the same instance that we had back in 2015, but probably next week when I get back, I'm going to be announcing the cutover for some of our pipelines. So 6 months we're going to be off of that and on the cloud use.
Then this guy will get all those jobs.
Yep.
You have 2 minutes if anyone else wants to ask a question.
All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Yes. Thank you very much.